It was a warm afternoon in the city, the kind where the sunlight felt heavy on the streets and people moved with a slow, lazy rhythm. Shops were open, traffic moved steadily, and the hum of city life created a background noise that most people barely noticed. A man was walking down the sidewalk, his steps even and relaxed. He was heading to a nearby appointment, his mind occupied with mundane thoughts about the day. He wore casual clothes, nothing flashy, just what someone would wear for a normal day out. He had no reason to expect anything unusual. Out of nowhere, a police car pulled up beside him, the tires crunching against the gravel as it stopped. The car's engine rumbled, and before he could even look up, a police officer stepped out. The officer's eyes were sharp, scanning the man from head to toe in a way that made the man pause, a flicker of unease passing through him. The officer didn't introduce himself, didn't ask questions politely. He simply shouted for the man to stop. The tone was harsh, commanding, and filled with tension. The man froze, confused but compliant. He raised his hand slightly, not in surrender but as a natural reaction to the sudden aggression. The officer approached with a noticeable stiffness in his movements, his hand hovering near his belt. Passers-by on the street noticed the exchange, some stopping to watch, sensing that something unusual was happening. The man tried to speak calmly, asking if there was a problem, but the officer cut him off, speaking in a tone that left no room for explanation. He accused the man of looking suspicious, though he offered no evidence, no real reason beyond his own assumptions. The man's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the officer's intensity. Despite the officer's aggression, the man did not resist. He followed the officer's commands, keeping his hands visible and his body still. He understood that any sudden movement could escalate the situation further. As the officer began handcuffing him, the man winced at the roughness, feeling the metal bite into his wrists. The officer did not explain why this was happening, and the man's polite questions were met with irritation and dismissive gestures. People on the sidewalk began recording with their phones. Their whispers filled the air, a mix of concern and disbelief. Why was this man being treated this way? What had he done? The sound of camera shutters and the low hum of voices added to the tension, making the situation feel like it was being watched not just by those on the street, but by the city itself. The man noticed the cameras, and though it added a small sense of relief, he remained careful, knowing that being calm was his best option. The officer's frustration grew as he tried to assert control. He leaned closer, his voice rising. He made assumptions about the man's intentions, his tone laced with impatience and bias. The man remained quiet, answering only when necessary, his words measured and respectful. He spoke slowly, hoping that reason might reach the officer, but it became clear that the officer's mind was already made up. He was not listening to what the man had to say. The tension drew more onlookers. People crossing the street paused, curious and concerned. A woman with a stroller stopped a few feet away, her child peeking over the edge of the carriage, sensing the gravity in the air. Others whispered to one another, expressing shock at the officer's aggression. Some shook their heads, others murmured, but all eyes were on the man and the officer. The city in that moment felt smaller, compressed around the confrontation as if the street itself was holding its breath. The man continued to comply, careful with every movement. He could feel the heat rising, not just from the sun but from the stress of being treated unjustly. He had experienced prejudice before, but never so publicly, so aggressively. He remained silent more often than not, understanding that arguing could make the situation worse. His mind raced, thinking of the steps he could take to protect himself while remaining calm. The officer, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the gathering crowd. His focus was on maintaining authority, even as the tension mounted. His body language was rigid and he spoke in short, clipped sentences. The man could feel the officer's irritation, his bias clear in every movement, every word. It was an uncomfortable, frightening situation, and the man's only defense was to stay composed, to remain human in the face of aggression. As the officer continued to assert control, the man noticed the fear and discomfort that his calmness seemed to generate. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but it gave him a small sense of hope. If he could remain steady, if he could not give the officer a reason to escalate further, maybe the situation could be contained. He focused on his breathing, on each step, on each word. He refused to let anger or fear dictate his actions. Time felt distorted. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The crowd grew, the whispers louder, the cameras capturing every moment. The man could see their eyes, some filled with concern, others with disbelief. They were witnesses now, part of the story unfolding on that sidewalk. The man felt a strange mixture of vulnerability and strength, knowing that how he handled this moment could make a difference, not just for himself but for those watching. The officer finally finished handcuffing him, standing back for a brief moment to assert dominance as if he had achieved control. But the man's calm presence remained unbroken. He spoke softly, asking why this was happening, but the officer ignored him, lost in his own assumptions. The man's patience and dignity stood in stark contrast to the officer's aggression, creating a tension that was almost tangible in the air. As the man was guided toward the squad car, his mind remained clear, focused. He thought about the witnesses, about the recordings, about the importance of keeping his composure. He understood the power dynamics at play, knew that any sudden move could have consequences. Yet he also recognized the absurdity of the situation. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, treated as a threat simply because of how he looked. People around them exchanged glances, some whispering encouragement, others questioning the officer's actions. The man noticed their eyes, their concern, and it gave him a small sense of connection, a reminder that he was not entirely alone. He kept walking, following the officer's commands, the sound of the city continuing around them, indifferent yet deeply intertwined with the moment. As they approached the squad car, the officer's grip on the man's arm was firm, controlling yet not violent. He had already exerted enough force to assert dominance, and now he seemed eager to finish. The man's hands were cuffed, his heart still racing, but he maintained a calm exterior. He understood that patience was his greatest tool, and he used it with care, mindful of every movement, every glance. The street seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Passers-by continued recording, whispering, observing. The man's calm, dignified presence contrasted with the officer's aggression, creating a story unfolding in real time, witnessed by dozens, potentially hundreds, through the eyes of those who documented it. It was a small moment in the life of the city, yet it carried weight, significance, and attention that could not be ignored. The man's mind wandered briefly to the absurdity of the situation. Here he was, a law-abiding citizen, treated as a criminal, judged by assumptions and prejudice. He reminded himself to stay calm, to remain human, and to focus on what he could control. His voice, his composure, and his actions were all tools he could wield, and he intended to use them wisely. As the officer opened the squad car door, the man kept his movements deliberate, careful not to give the officer a reason to escalate further. He stepped inside, keeping his head up, maintaining dignity in the face of unjust treatment. The officer closed the door, still tense but now aware that the man had not responded with anger or fear. The balance of power had shifted slightly, though the officer did not yet realize it. The street gradually returned to its normal rhythm, though whispers and recordings continued. Onlookers lingered, curious about what would happen next. The man sat quietly in the back of the car, his thoughts focused, his mind sharp. He knew that the moment was far from over, but he also understood that how he handled it now could change everything. He remained calm, aware of the eyes on him, aware of the tension in the air, and ready for whatever would come next. The man sat in the back of the police car, the cuffs tight around his wrists, and took a slow breath. He could feel the eyes of the officer on him, heavy with suspicion and aggression, but he kept his expression calm. He knew that any sudden movement or defensive reaction could make the situation worse. Every second counted, and he had to maintain control over his own behavior, even if the officer had lost control over his. The officer slammed the car door, the noise echoing sharply. He got into the driver's seat, muttering under his breath about the man's attitude. The man kept silent, letting the officer fill the space with his words. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He understood that patience was more powerful than confrontation in this moment. He observed the officer carefully, noting every twitch, every sign of irritation, trying to read what might happen next. The officer demanded to know why the man was in the area. His tone was harsh, almost accusatory. The man explained calmly that he had an appointment nearby, giving the exact location and the purpose of his visit. He did not raise his voice, did not get defensive. He answered each question politely and clearly. But the officer was impatient. He interrupted the man, speaking over him, making assumptions about his intentions without listening. It was clear that the officer's bias was affecting his judgment. Outside, people continued to watch. Some had stopped in the street, cameras and phones raised, recording the interaction. The murmurs of the crowd added a layer of tension to the scene. The man could feel their attention, their concern, and it reminded him that even though he was trapped in this small car, he was not completely alone. He had to stay composed not just for himself, but also for the witnesses who were quietly hoping that justice would prevail. The officer grew more agitated, and his questions became more pointed. He accused the man of hiding something, of being dishonest. The man stayed calm, answering each accusation with facts and calm words. He repeated the details of where he was going and why, carefully articulating his answers. The officer's bias, however, prevented him from accepting anything the man said. It was as though the officer's mind had already made up the story, and no truth could change it. The man noticed the officer's hand twitch near his belt, a subtle but telling sign of how quickly things could escalate. He knew that one wrong move, one moment of frustration from the officer, and the situation could turn violent. His heart beat steadily, but he did not let his eyes betray any fear. He continued to speak in calm, measured tones, aware that his voice was one of his few tools in controlling the unfolding chaos. The officer began to make derogatory remarks, his language sharp and offensive. The man remained composed, refusing to respond in kind. He realized that reacting with anger would only escalate the situation, and he was determined to survive this moment with dignity. Each word he chose was deliberate, each movement intentional, calculated to avoid provoking the officer further. He knew that calmness could be a form of strength, and he wielded it like a shield. As the car idled at the curb, the man noticed the expressions of the people outside. Some were shocked, some whispered words of encouragement, and others simply recorded, silently hoping that the situation would not end badly. He felt a small sense of connection to these strangers, a reminder that humanity was watching, that someone cared. Even in the face of aggression and prejudice, he was not entirely alone. Then a subtle shift happened. The man reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, making sure the officer noticed the movement. The officer stiffened, his hand moving instinctively closer to his belt. The tension in the car spiked, the air heavy with anticipation. Passers-by leaned closer, cameras focused on the back of the police car. The man's movements were calm, unhurried, but deliberate. He reached for something, and the officer's face tightened with expectation. In a calm, measured voice, the man said the words that would change the course of the encounter. "I'm FBI." The officer froze, the words hitting him like a sudden jolt. His eyes widened and his body went rigid. The words hung in the air, almost impossible to process at first. The man held up his credentials, showing them clearly to the officer. The metal badge and credentials glinted under the afternoon sun, undeniable proof of his authority. The officer's initial aggression gave way to a visible panic, his mind racing to understand what had just happened. The man did not raise his voice or move suddenly. He remained calm, letting the credentials speak for themselves. The officer's panic became obvious, his confidence shaken, replaced by confusion and fear. He had just aggressively arrested a federal agent without realizing it. The weight of that realization hit him hard, and he struggled to maintain control of his composure. Outside, the crowd reacted immediately. Whispers turned into audible murmurs, and cameras continued to record. People could see the shift, the sudden power reversal that occurred in the small space of the car. The man's calm authority contrasted sharply with the officer's panic. The incident was no longer just an aggressive arrest. It had become a moment of accountability, a lesson in humility and the consequences of assumptions. The officer stammered, trying to regain his authority. He muttered apologies, though his words sounded forced, almost mechanical. The man listened carefully, his expression neutral. He understood that the officer was frightened, not just by the situation, but also by the potential repercussions of his actions. He allowed the officer a moment to gather himself, but he also made it clear that his patience had limits. He explained, still calmly, that such behavior could have serious consequences and that the officer needed to understand the gravity of the situation. The tension in the car remained palpable. The man maintained his dignity, his calmness a sharp contrast to the officer's anxiety. He spoke clearly, making sure his message was understood. Outside, the witnesses continued to record, capturing every second. The man knew that these recordings could be crucial, not just for his own safety but also for ensuring that such incidents were addressed appropriately. The officer's hands shook slightly as he finally began to loosen the cuffs. The man did not rush him, did not press him to act faster. He knew that pushing the officer could trigger another wave of panic. Instead, he stayed composed, demonstrating authority through calmness and self-control. The officer finally removed the cuffs, his movements hesitant, uncertain. The man's patience and professionalism had turned the tables completely. Once free, the man did not raise his voice or demand apologies. He simply reminded the officer that actions like these had consequences. He emphasized the importance of restraint, of not letting assumptions and prejudice dictate behavior. The officer nodded nervously, his face pale, realizing that he had made a serious error. The crowd outside whispered among themselves, witnessing not just a reversal of roles but a powerful example of dignity and calm under pressure. The man stepped out of the car slowly, maintaining his composure. He thanked the officer quietly for cooperating without any hint of anger or resentment. His calmness was disarming, and it left the officer unsure how to react. The crowd continued to watch, recording, talking quietly among themselves. The incident had taken on a life of its own, a lesson unfolding in real time on a busy city street. The officer finally spoke again, offering a strained apology. The man accepted it calmly but made sure to leave a clear message. Behavior like this could not be repeated, and assumptions based on race were unacceptable. The officer nodded again, silently acknowledging the mistake and the lesson he had just been taught. People began to disperse slowly, though some lingered, still recording and talking about what they had seen. The man walked away from the car, his steps measured, his mind clear. He understood the danger he had faced, the prejudice he had confronted, and the importance of maintaining calm and dignity throughout. He reflected on how quickly assumptions could lead to unnecessary aggression, and how composure, knowledge, and authority could change the course of an encounter in an instant. By the time he left the scene, the story had already started spreading. Witnesses shared videos on social media, and the incident quickly gained attention. The man did not seek fame or recognition. He simply wanted to ensure that justice and accountability were upheld. He had turned a dangerous situation into a lesson for everyone who witnessed it, demonstrating that calmness and professionalism could overcome aggression and prejudice. As he walked away, the man thought about the broader implications. He knew that racism and bias in law enforcement were serious issues, and he hoped that this incident would encourage reflection and change. He understood that his actions that day had saved him from potential harm and had also created a powerful example for others. His story would serve as a reminder that dignity, patience, and calm authority could make a difference even in the most dangerous situations. The city returned to its normal rhythm, the hum of traffic and chatter resuming, but the memory of the incident lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The man's calm courage had left a mark, and the officer's realization of his mistake would not be easily forgotten. The events of that afternoon would continue to resonate, a story of how one person's composure and awareness could confront bias and demand accountability in a world that often judged too quickly. The officer sat behind the wheel, his hands gripping it tightly, staring at the man who now held an undeniable authority over him. The words "I'm FBI" had shifted the dynamic completely, and the officer could feel the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. He had approached the situation with bias, letting assumptions guide his actions, and now he realized the seriousness of what he had done. The man's calm presence filled the car, a stark contrast to the officer's sudden panic. The man's voice was steady, clear, and calm. He spoke to the officer in a way that left no room for argument, but also without aggression. He explained his role, his duties, and the importance of respecting boundaries and protocol. Every word carried authority, not because of anger or loudness, but because it was grounded in knowledge, professionalism, and experience. The officer listened, nodding occasionally, but his hand still shook slightly, and he struggled to meet the man's steady gaze. Outside the car, the crowd had grown. Passers-by who had initially been curious now whispered among themselves, realizing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Phones were still recording, capturing the reactions, the tension, and the power shift that had taken place. People pointed and murmured, some expressing disbelief that the officer had acted so aggressively without knowing who the man was. Others shook their heads, muttering about assumptions and the dangers of prejudice. The man in the back of the car stayed composed, aware that the situation was delicate. He knew that any sudden move or harsh tone could reignite the officer's tension. He carefully controlled his body language, keeping his hands visible and moving slowly when necessary. Each movement was deliberate, calculated to maintain calm and authority. He understood that in moments like these, composure was a tool of survival. The officer finally spoke, his voice trembling slightly. He muttered an apology, trying to explain his actions, but the words felt forced and inadequate. The man listened without interruption, letting the officer speak, understanding that this was part of the process. He did not respond with anger or criticism. Instead, he maintained a calm and professional tone, emphasizing the seriousness of the officer's mistake without attacking him personally. The crowd outside reacted to the officer's apology. Some whispered among themselves, some nodded in approval, and others continued recording. The incident was becoming more than just an interaction between two people. It was now a lesson in accountability, a story of how power, bias, and assumptions could collide, and how calmness and professionalism could turn a dangerous situation around. The man understood this and used the opportunity to set an example. He explained the legal implications of the officer's actions, speaking clearly and without threat. He reminded the officer that false arrests, especially involving federal agents, carried serious consequences. The words were firm but delivered without anger. The officer's panic grew as he realized the magnitude of his error. He had acted out of prejudice, not reason, and the man's calm authority made it impossible to ignore the consequences. The man then discussed the importance of respect, not just for him as an agent, but for all people. He spoke about the danger of assumptions, the pain of being judged based on appearance, and the responsibility of law enforcement to act with fairness and integrity. His words were measured, thoughtful, and human. He connected not with anger but with understanding, showing the officer that professionalism required both knowledge and empathy. The officer's demeanor shifted gradually. His shoulders slumped and he avoided direct eye contact. He was no longer the aggressor. He was now the one being corrected, guided, and held accountable. The man remained calm, not gloating or taking pleasure in the officer's discomfort. Instead, he maintained a quiet authority, allowing the truth and his professional presence to make the impact. Outside, the crowd continued to watch in awe. People whispered about the unexpected turn of events. Some expressed relief that the man remained unharmed, while others voiced frustration about the officer's behavior. The recordings captured every second, every expression, and every word. The incident was becoming a powerful example of how dignity, knowledge, and calm composure could transform a dangerous situation. The man emphasized that this encounter was a reminder of the importance of training, awareness, and understanding. He spoke about the systemic issues that allowed bias to influence behavior, and the personal responsibility each officer had to check assumptions. The officer listened, absorbing the words and nodding in understanding, though the tension in his body remained. The man also addressed the witnesses, speaking calmly to those who had gathered nearby. He reminded them to stay safe, to remain observers rather than participants, and to document incidents like this to ensure accountability. His tone was gentle but firm, and the crowd responded with quiet acknowledgement. People felt a mixture of relief and respect, realizing that they were witnessing a rare moment of professionalism and courage. The officer attempted to explain himself further, but the man stopped him gently, emphasizing that the explanation was less important than the lesson. He reminded the officer that actions had consequences and that every interaction mattered. The officer nodded again, understanding that he had crossed a line and that the path forward required reflection, accountability, and humility. The man then carefully outlined the proper protocol for situations like this. He described how officers should engage with civilians, emphasizing respect, patience, and the importance of communication. He spoke as if mentoring, offering guidance rather than judgment. The officer listened attentively, realizing that he had much to learn from this encounter, and that his assumptions had endangered both himself and the person he had targeted. As the conversation continued, the tension in the car gradually eased. The officer's initial panic gave way to contemplation. He began to ask questions not defensively, but out of a desire to understand the correct way to handle similar situations. The man answered calmly, providing clear guidance, examples, and reasoning. The exchange was professional, focused on learning and accountability rather than blame. The witnesses outside began to disperse slowly, still recording but giving space as the situation de-escalated. The man and the officer were now engaged in a conversation that, while tense, was constructive. The shift was evident, and the atmosphere no longer felt dangerous but rather educational. People whispered to one another about what they had witnessed, recognizing the rarity of such a reversal in power dynamics. The man reminded the officer once more about the importance of reflection. He emphasized that understanding bias, maintaining composure, and acting with professionalism were not just guidelines but essential responsibilities. The officer nodded silently, absorbing the weight of the lesson, realizing how narrowly he had avoided serious consequences. Finally, the man stood to leave the car, still calm, still composed. He thanked the officer for listening, for acknowledging the mistake, and for beginning to understand the gravity of his actions. The officer remained seated, humbled and visibly shaken, but also aware that he had been given a chance to learn from this encounter. As the man walked away, he glanced at the witnesses, acknowledging their presence without words. They had seen the power of calm authority and dignity in action. He moved with measured steps, his mind focused, reflecting on the incident and the broader implications. He knew that this encounter would be remembered, discussed and analyzed, not for the initial aggression, but for the way he had handled it, the lesson it had provided, and the example it set. The city around him returned to its rhythm, but the memory of the incident lingered in the minds of those who had observed it. The man's calm professionalism had not only protected him, but had transformed a potentially dangerous situation into a lesson for the officer and for the community. The street, now quieter, still held traces of the tension and the drama that had unfolded, and the impact of his composure would continue to resonate long after he walked away. He continued toward his appointment, thoughtful but calm, aware of how quickly assumptions could turn ordinary situations into dangerous ones. The lesson was clear. Patience, professionalism, and knowledge could protect against injustice and fear. And while the officer still faced the reality of his actions, the man had made sure that the encounter would be remembered as a demonstration of dignity and calm authority, a reminder of what it meant to stay human under pressure. The man walked slowly away from the squad car, the tension in the air beginning to ease but still lingering like a shadow over the street. His hands, now free from the cuffs, swung naturally at his sides. Every step he took was measured, deliberate, and calm. The city around him continued its rhythm, but the echoes of what had just happened seemed to hang in the air. Passers-by whispered to one another, their voices full of disbelief and curiosity. Some continued to record the event, ensuring that every detail was preserved, while others simply watched, trying to process what they had witnessed. The officer remained in the car for a moment longer, still shaken by the sudden shift in authority. He had approached the situation with aggression, driven by assumptions, and had learned in an instant how dangerous those assumptions could be. His hands rested on the wheel, trembling slightly as he realized the gravity of his actions. He had treated a law-abiding citizen with undue force and had no idea who he was dealing with. The man's calm demeanor and professional authority had completely overturned the officer's sense of control. The man paused briefly on the sidewalk, taking a deep breath and glancing at the people around him. Their expressions ranged from shock to admiration, and he allowed himself a small moment to acknowledge that his calmness had influenced the situation. He understood that his ability to remain composed had prevented further escalation, and he silently committed to sharing the lesson from this encounter in ways that could reach a wider audience. The crowd began to disperse slowly, yet the recordings and whispered conversations would ensure that the incident continued to live beyond the street. People were talking about what had happened, discussing how quickly assumptions could lead to unnecessary aggression. Some expressed outrage at the officer's behavior, while others marveled at the man's composure and professional handling of the situation. The story was spreading already, capturing the attention of those who were interested in accountability, fairness, and justice. The officer finally stepped out of the squad car, his steps hesitant and uncertain. He approached the man, hands slightly raised as if in surrender, a gesture of humility rather than authority. His voice was low, trembling as he offered a formal apology. The man listened carefully, not interrupting, and acknowledged the apology calmly. He understood that the officer was shaken, not just by fear of immediate consequences, but also by the realization of his own bias and the potential impact it could have had on someone's life. The man spoke with quiet authority, emphasizing the seriousness of the situation and the importance of change. He did not attack the officer personally. Instead, he highlighted the need for awareness, accountability, and professionalism. He explained how quickly assumptions based on race could lead to dangerous misunderstandings and why it was critical for law enforcement to follow proper protocols. Every word was deliberate, meant to educate, correct, and inspire reflection. The officer nodded, absorbing the lesson. His earlier aggression was replaced with a sense of humility and recognition of the mistake he had made. He understood that his actions had not only threatened the man's safety, but also undermined the integrity of his position as an officer. The man continued to speak, outlining steps for better conduct, clear communication, and the importance of treating every individual with dignity and respect, regardless of appearances. As they spoke, the witnesses continued to observe respectfully. Some quietly documented the encounter, others simply watched, absorbing the lessons unfolding before them. The man addressed them briefly, reminding them to act responsibly in similar situations, to remain safe, and to ensure that incidents of misconduct or bias were recorded accurately. His tone was gentle but firm, demonstrating that even in difficult circumstances, one could maintain control and influence positive outcomes. The conversation between the man and the officer grew more reflective. The officer asked questions, seeking guidance and understanding rather than justification. The man responded calmly, providing advice on handling tense situations with composure, avoiding assumptions, and prioritizing communication and observation over immediate judgment. He highlighted the importance of professionalism, patience, and empathy in every interaction. The city continued to hum around them, indifferent to the life lessons occurring on that particular street. Cars drove by, the sounds of engines and horns mixing with distant conversations and footsteps. Yet within this ordinary urban setting, an extraordinary lesson in human behavior and professionalism had just unfolded. It was a reminder that even in the face of aggression and bias, calmness, knowledge, and dignity could influence outcomes profoundly. The man emphasized that learning from mistakes was essential, not just for the officer but for the community at large. He spoke about the broader consequences of assumptions and bias, explaining that one moment of aggression could ripple outward, affecting trust, safety, and relationships within the community. His words carried weight because they were grounded in experience and delivered with care and clarity. The officer listened intently, occasionally nodding, clearly affected by the man's words. He recognized the error in his judgment and began to understand the responsibility that came with his role. The man's guidance was not punitive. It was instructional, offering a path forward to prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. The conversation was no longer tense but constructive, a dialogue focused on reflection and improvement. Meanwhile, the witnesses slowly started to disperse. Some walked away talking quietly. Others uploaded videos and shared the story online. The incident was already becoming more than just a local event. It was a story about accountability, calm authority, and the impact of assumptions. People were captivated not by the initial aggression, but by the way it had been handled, the professionalism and composure that had turned a potential disaster into a learning experience. The man took a few more steps down the sidewalk, feeling a quiet sense of resolve. He understood the importance of using this experience to highlight the dangers of bias and the value of composure. He hoped that his actions would encourage reflection, not just from the officer involved, but from law enforcement and the broader community as well. The goal was not to humiliate, but to educate, to demonstrate that dignity and calmness could overcome fear, aggression, and prejudice. He glanced back at the officer one last time, noting the humility in his posture and the seriousness in his eyes. The officer had learned a lesson, one that would likely stay with him for a long time. The man knew that change often began with awareness, and he had ensured that awareness had been brought to the officer in a clear, memorable, and impactful way. The street gradually returned to its normal rhythm, the sounds of traffic, conversation, and city life blending together. Yet the lesson lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The man's calm courage and professionalism had transformed a tense and dangerous situation into a story of reflection, accountability, and human dignity. It was a reminder to everyone that even small actions and words could have a profound impact, and that maintaining composure under pressure was a powerful tool. As the man walked toward his destination, he thought about the broader implications of what had just occurred. He considered how quickly assumptions could escalate, how easily bias could lead to unnecessary aggression, and how vital it was for people to remain aware, calm, and professional in every interaction. He hoped that the incident would spark discussions, reflections, and positive change in behavior, both within law enforcement and in society as a whole. He continued walking, confident and composed, knowing that the encounter had not only protected him, but had also set an example for others. He had turned a moment of potential danger into a story of human resilience, professionalism, and dignity. The impact of his calm authority would continue to resonate, influencing behavior, encouraging reflection, and reminding everyone of the power of staying composed in the face of prejudice and aggression. By the time he reached his destination, the story of the encounter had already begun spreading. People discussed it online and in person, reflecting on the lessons learned. The man did not seek attention or recognition. His goal was simply to ensure that the importance of calm, dignity, and professionalism was understood and remembered. He knew that the lessons of that afternoon would extend far beyond the street, reaching others who could learn from his example. The city continued its rhythm, but the memory of the incident lingered in the minds of those who had been present. The man's calm, professional response had created a lasting impact, turning a moment of aggression into a lesson in human behavior and accountability. It was a story that would be told, remembered, and reflected upon, a story of dignity, patience, and the power of calm authority in the face of bias and aggression. The man continued walking down the city streets, the sounds of cars, chatter, and distant music filling the air. The warmth of the afternoon sun pressed gently on his shoulders, but he barely noticed it. His mind was focused on the events that had just unfolded, the tension he had faced, and the way he had maintained composure. He knew that this encounter had the power to leave a lasting impression, not only on the officer involved, but also on the witnesses who had watched everything unfold. As he walked, he reflected on the officer's reaction and the lessons that could be drawn from it. The officer had acted based on assumptions and prejudice, allowing bias to guide his actions without taking the time to understand the situation. The man had experienced aggression and humiliation, but he had responded with calmness, patience, and clarity. He understood that by maintaining control over his own behavior, he had been able to transform a potentially dangerous situation into a teaching moment. He thought about the bystanders who had witnessed the incident. People of all ages had stopped, some out of curiosity, others out of concern, and many had recorded videos. He hoped that they would see more than just a confrontation between a police officer and a civilian. He wanted them to understand the power of calm authority, the importance of professionalism, and the value of staying composed under pressure. This was more than a personal experience. It was an opportunity to show others how dignity and patience could make a difference. The incident had